gentlemen, you're most welcome to the CMRS seminar. This afternoon we have the immense pleasure, I have also the immense pleasure of welcoming a very good friend, Dr. Gerasimos Tsourapas, a brilliant young political scientist who has already made imprints in the study of migration from a political science perspective. You're most welcome. Dr. Tsourapas is at present lecturer in Middle East politics at the University of Birmingham, the Department of Political Science. As I said, he's a political scientist and he has made imprints in the study of migration from a political science perspective, and therefore it is no surprise that his research interest, his first research interest is in migration politics, and he's also interested in diasporas in the Middle East, which brings together both his interests, first in migration studies and second in the Middle East. He has gained a lifelong grant from the British Academy on migration diplomacy in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Eastern Mediterranean being part, extension, in the environment of the Middle East. Dr. Tsourapas will talk to us today about the soft power of diasporas as soft power, I guess, of the countries of origin. So I am, and I'm sure you also are very interested in this subject, and Dr. Tsourapas comes from Greece, and the Greek diaspora holds a good amount of power or at least this is what is assumed about the power it holds in American politics, for instance. So, in any case, I do not want to take the floor and say what assumptions I have. I will leave it to Dr. Tsourapas to give his lecture, after which I will have a few comments to make, and then the floor will be open to the audience to put questions to Dr. Gerasimos.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Dr. Ibrahim. Thank you, Maisa and the organizers for putting this together. And thank you everybody for coming on the late Monday afternoon. When I first came to Cairo for research some 5 years ago, Dr. Ibrahim and the Center for Migration and Refugee Studies at AUC were such a welcoming home. As some of you know, the PhD is a very solitary experience. It's always you and your dissertation, and you're battling all sorts of demons. So it was always good to have a home at AUC to talk to other people, to communicate my research. And so I always value the opportunity to come back and talk to AUC scholars and staff and students and everyone. So please feel free to raise questions or to write them down. I'll be happy to have a discussion after this. I promised myself talk for about 45 minutes, so I'll try to stick to that, which gives us quite a bit of time for discussion. Let me start my, okay, good. So what I'm talking about today is diasporas as a form of soft power in world politics. And this is part of my research agenda. The photo you see here is from my own research on Egyptian migration politics. This is two Yemeni girls in early 1960s Yemen, studying in a school built by Egyptian engineers and staffed solely by Egyptian teachers. So I use this as a sort of an introduction and a good metaphor essentially for the soft power of migration, this sort of aspect of migratory politics that doesn't have to do with hard power, but has to do more with changing people's beliefs, ideas, attitudes, and so on and so forth. I always try to start with a bit of a structure so that you know what I'm going to talk about. And essentially I wanted to address two questions in this 44 minutes. Firstly, I wanted to ask, what are states' non-material goals when promoting labor migration? When it comes to labor migration, we always sort of think about economics. It is labor after all. Are there any non-material goals? Are there any political goals to be gained for states by exporting labor migrants? And secondly, and a bit more concretely, what kind of foreign policy purposes might these migrant and diaspora groups serve? So I'm particularly interested in the international relations of this. And the arguments I'm putting forth are twofold. Firstly, that the main strategy, the non-material strategies that states have in their minds when promoting labor migration has to do with soft power. This issue that Joseph Nye brought to the forefront some 20 years ago that has a lot to do with non-military, non-coercive, much softer ideas of political power. And more concretely, what I'm hoping to try to convince you in my lecture is that migrant and diaspora groups are also employed in order to win host states' hearts and minds, as we call them. So they're not employed as an interstate weapon. They're employed in a way to convince society to bring sort of the host state society into the same sort of framework of mind with the sending state. And I'll tell you what I mean in just a second. Very briefly on the theory of this, and this is only one slide of theory, I promise, but I included it thinking that somebody might be an academic from the audience that they might appreciate this bit. When it comes to labor migration, we chiefly view it as an economic instrument and as an economic process rather than a political one. Labor migration has to do a lot with remittances, reducing unemployment, targeting overpopulation. These are not political issues per se. These are more economic issues. Even the debate about brain drain versus brain waste, all these sort of aspects are developmental. They're not really political. When it comes really down to it, we're talking about supply and demand. We're talking about this neoclassical theory of migration that essentially leaves little space for politics. So this is where I'm trying to essentially insert this presentation and this work and argue a bit against this. Diasporas, on the other hand, and by diasporas, I take this broad conceptualization that means citizens, descendants, and questions. So when it comes to, for instance, to the Egyptian diaspora, we're talking about Egyptian citizens abroad. We're talking about their children and their grandchildren, so first and second generation Egyptian diaspora. But we're also talking about questions, people that don't have a citizenship of that country but still feel some attachment to it. So this is my definition of diaspora. And these are viewed more politically in the scholarship. So some scholars argue that diasporas constitute a form of democratization. And this has been proven in the post-communist era, where diasporas from abroad came in and helped the process of democratization. As Dr. Ibrahim said, I'm Greek. When the Greek state transitioned from dictatorship to democracy in the 1970s, one of the key figures there was Konstantinos Karamanlis, who came in from Paris in this plane, having lived in exile for decades of years, and we all put our faith in this diaspora individual to come in and democratize Greece. A similar debate was happening in Egypt a few years back about El-Baradei, for instance, and the power of the Egyptian diaspora to democratize. So that's one aspect of the literature. Another aspect of the literature has to do with diasporas as lobbying power, and this is what Dr. Ibrahim also suggested, sort of the Armenian diaspora, the Greek diaspora, functioning as lobbying agents in Washington, in London, in Paris. Most often what we associate with this sort of framework is the Israeli diaspora. The Israeli lobby in the United States functioning as an instrument of the Israeli state to press for certain foreign policy objectives, right? That's fairly self-explanatory. My question here is that, is this the extent of political power for migrant and diaspora groups from the sending state perspective? Is this all there is, essentially? And I'm arguing that actually there's another side to this that we have yet to explore that has to do with soft power. And to help you demonstrate this, I go back to Egypt, essentially. So I'm really happy to be giving this talk here. Egypt in the 1950s and 1960s. This revolutionary, very interesting time, at which point Mohammed Hassan Haikal comes in 1961. This is the point of the union between Egypt and Syria. He comes in and says, well, we need to differentiate between Egypt as a state and Egypt as a revolution. This very short but very powerful statement that has to do with another conceptualization of Egypt that is no longer bound territorially by its borders, but comes to encompass, for him at least, and for the Nasserites, the entire Arab world and beyond. So I'm going to focus on this. I'm going to focus on Egyptian migration as soft power in this very interesting time between the Free Officers' Revolution in 1952 and the death of Nasser in 1970. These sort of two broad decades. And I included this, I usually include this when I give talks in America or in Europe. I don't need to sell you on why we need to focus on Egypt. Hopefully, there is a degree of socio-political and historical centrality about the Egyptian state in the Arab world and in the Middle East that makes it really, really powerful, both before Nasser, during Nasser, and afterwards. We're talking about the largest country in the Arab world population-wise, and we're also talking about the main supplier of migrant labor historically in the region. So there is a number of reasons of why should we focus on Egypt. A particular reason I always cite when it comes to focusing on this time period is that, well, it hasn't been examined. When I started my PhD, people would tell me, well, why are you looking at migration under Nasser? Egyptians didn't really migrate under Nasser. And this is something that President Nasser himself would repeat quite often. Egyptians don't migrate. If you think about studies of Egyptian migration, 99 out of 100 times, these would be studies after 1970. Egyptians in Libya, Egyptians in the Gulf, Egyptians in Europe and America. Nobody really talks about what happened before 1970. And this has to do a lot with this discourse and a lot with this sort of academic approach to this that says that Egyptians always prefer their own land, few left to study or travel, they do not migrate essentially. So I'm trying to sort of pick a hole on that main argument. And that I'm doing because firstly this means that we don't really study Egypt before 1970, those of us that study migration politics. But also, we haven't yet associated migration politics with the broader regional politics of the time. And one of the things I'll be focusing on in this PowerPoint is this Arab Cold War. What we term essentially this intense antagonism between revolutionary republics, namely Egypt, Syria to a lesser extent, and the monarchies, the conservative monarchies of the Arab world, which clash in the 1950s and 1960s, either quite violently, as in Yemen, where we have a full proxy war, and I'll talk about this in a minute, or a bit more on the level of propaganda. So some of you might know the Voice of the Arabs program that Nasser would launch and sort of talk revolutionary ideals across the Arab world, all these sort of issues. Migration has yet to feature into this analysis. So that's what I'm trying to do. Very briefly, as a bit of a background, before we get to what happens under the Free Officers, we need to establish the fact that Egypt, for a number of socio-historical reasons, had an earlier developmental trajectory than most Arab states. Muhammad Ali came in and pursued policies of modernization and state reform already in the early 1800s. We have the founding of Dar al-Ulum, which is the training for Arabic teachers. Al-Azhar was already there for centuries. Cairo University was already established before many Arab states had gained their independence. So we're talking about a degree of developmental progress in Egypt that was lacking in other parts of the Arab world. Why do we care about this? Well, we care about this because Egypt was able to use this in order to help promote developmental ideas elsewhere in the Arab world. So Egyptian scholars, namely teachers of Arabic, but also legal scholars, would travel the Arab world in the early 20th century, primarily teaching Arabic, but also tackling these Arab shortages in educational staff. Egypt would become a Shakik al-Kubra of the Arab world, the big sister, who would provide for the Arab world at the time. And there's all sorts of debates, I'm just including one by Al-Nazar here, that talk a lot about how Egypt was progressing at a higher pace in terms of education, in terms of development than other states. Why did I mention this? Well, this is the situation that existed when the free officers came in 1952. And what Nasser does and what the regime does is they expand, they systematize, and they politicize regional Egyptian migration. So we have the institutionalization of what we call the secondment program in Egypt. If you remember in the previous slide, I talked about a few dozen sort of teachers traveling the Arab world every year to teach Arabic and whatnot. Once Nasser comes in, we're talking about an organized dispatch abroad of 580 teachers. This is Ministry of Education archive. So 580 teachers sent abroad in 1953 alone. So we're talking about a huge expansion in the number of teachers sent abroad. By the mid-1960s, we're already talking about 4,600 teachers. So we're talking, hopefully you can see this large expansion of educational staff being dispatched abroad. So I'm trying to understand the politics of this and the power of this. And why should we look at it from the politics perspective? Why is this not yet another story of, well, Egyptian teachers trying to find better opportunities abroad? Why is this political rather than just economic? Well, there are a number of reasons I identify. For one, the Egyptian state at the time was suffering from intense educational shortages. Nasser had made education free and public for all Egyptians. Teachers were really badly needed. The export of teachers through the Egyptian state, this is from Wynne, who was a teacher at the time, she argues that the export of teachers was a sacrifice to Egyptians. Up and down the Nile Valley, she wrote, it is a common sight to see Egyptian schoolrooms empty for lack of teachers. So, if these schoolrooms are empty, why is Nasser sending them abroad rather than keeping them in? So this doesn't really make sense. A second argument here has to do with the process of state developmentalism and war preparations. At the time in Egypt, there exists the policy of al-taklif, which is this mandatory work program that forbade certain professions, certain individuals from migrating for a number of years. So if you were an engineer, for instance, you had to have worked in Egypt for a number of years before being sent abroad. At the same time, we have these huge preparations of war with Israel. So why is Egypt sending away its most needed staff and its youngest individuals? And thirdly, and perhaps the most obvious sort of argument against this economic aspect of labor migration has to do with who foots the bill for this. And in many times, Egypt itself was paying for the wages of these teachers abroad. This is the New York Times interviewing an Egyptian teacher in Libya, and he actually goes on record and says, I've never been so rich in my life. The Egyptian government pays my salary at home in addition to my salary here, and they fly me home for free for my annual leave. So what's happening here? Why is the Egyptian state allowing this? It doesn't make sense from an economics perspective. One of the most interesting things that I'm uncovering, this is part of the British archives on this, is how this works. And this is a British officer reporting back from Sharjah, and he mentions this story from Sheikh Sakr, who tells him that he received this letter from the Egyptian Council of the Revolution. This is the free officers, and this guy called Colonel Abdul Hamid is offering to send a number of school teachers and doctors to Sharjah at the Egyptian government's expense. So this is unsigned, this is no official heading, and he says at the bottom, he offers 6 school teachers for the primary school in Sharjah, 3 engineers, a doctor and a lady doctor. And he says that the Egyptian government would pay all these expenses except for accommodation. And also he offers to show Sheikh Sakr the wonders and the sights of Alexandria, if he so wishes. This is very interesting for those of you who care about the kafala system, for instance, and how it evolved and the corruption that is built into this. It's a very interesting sort of tidbit. This is back in the late 1950s. This is what I've uncovered from the archives in terms of who goes where. And this is statistics that the Nasserite regime kept at the time. it might not mean a lot to you if you just look at it like that, but if you pay attention to who was sent where, hopefully the politics of this will come in. For instance, Morocco only receives Egyptian teachers in 1956. And this is not an accident if you think about North African history. This has to do with when the French leave. Once the French depart in 1956, Nasser arguably sees this as an opportunity to send Egyptian teachers there. Teachers stopped being sent in Iraq in 1958. Again, not an accident given that Iraq entered into a very short-lived alliance with Jordan against the national state. So both Jordan and Iraq stopped receiving migrants. So you can see there's, hopefully I'm getting the point across, that there's something there that's political rather than economic. Trying to uncover this has been quite difficult, partly because all of this is buried in the past, and also this was never actually made quite known. So we can uncover that in 1954 we have formal rules set in about who goes where and how, once the Ministry of Education becomes the Ministry of Education and Public Instruction. We have set rules in terms of who can get recruited and why. So we have Egyptians that have to have at least 3 years of experience. They need to have appropriate letters of reference. And if they were men, they need to have accomplished or completed their military service. It's the Ministry of Education's job to decide where they are sent and who is sent where. And they've been granted a leave for 3 years, renewable for a total of 5. What is interesting is that Egyptians need to not have a criminal record, and they need to indicate that they would not work with an agency openly hostile to Egypt or its national interests, or to undermine the developmental goals of Egypt. This is from newspaper archives. And there's a lot of reports about how ministerial training is taking place in order to acquaint or to enlighten these teachers before they go abroad. A very interesting little tidbit I found quite fascinating is that Al-Ahram, for instance, would publish annual lists of these teachers, arguably in a way to valorize them. So what does this have to do with soft power, and does this at all have to do anything with politics? Well, one of my case studies that I want to talk about to you about today has to do with Yemen. And in Yemen, as I talked at the beginning, we have an intense rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Egypt in terms of the Yemeni civil war at the time. Once Abdullah Hassan comes in and challenges the Saudi-backed Yemeni monarchy and declares the creation of the pro-Egypt Yemen Arab Republic, he appeals to Egypt. He appeals to Nasser for support, and he asks for technical and administrative help. And once Al-Sadr does this, Nasser responds, and this is from Rahmi, who studied this. He argues Egypt essentially moves into Yemen, not only with tanks and jets and soldiers, but also with 300 primary and secondary school teachers, administrative advisors, doctors for the new hospitals. For those of you who care about the history of Egypt, for me it's very much reminiscent of how Napoleon came in a few centuries ago, but that's a different story. This is from Dana Schmidt, who was the New York Times correspondent at the time in Yemen, and he gives us a good account of what transpired. And he says he was very impressed by the extent of this Hearts and Minds campaign among the Yemenis. They installed water pumps, school teaching, they provided all sorts of professional advice, agriculture, engineering, medical. They were trying essentially to introduce the Yemenis to modern life, he argues. And this is a picture of Yemeni nurses Egyptian nurses in Yemen from the Arab Observer. And he identifies how the Egyptians brought in actually 100 ulemas as well in order to actually interfere with how the Yemenis interpreted the difference between the Shafi and the Zaydi sects. But that's a very interesting but different story. One of the key iconic images of this has to do with military staff coming in and training. This is an Egyptian military officer training Yemenis how to fight and how to fight in this civil war against the Saudi-backed monarchical regime. One of the other interesting things I have tried to, this is still a work in progress for me. So this is something that comes up in the British archives. And these are a couple of leaflets that the British intercepted in Sana'a. And these were disseminated by Egyptians. So somehow the British managed to get a hold of them and determine that they were printed in Egypt. And it says all sorts of interesting things. What I found interesting is things like sons of Yemen do not clap for Gamal. Gamal does not need your applause. He does not require your admiration. Your biggest compliment to Gamal would be when you unite together and organize yourselves and you eliminate the monarchy and declare the birth of the Yemeni People's Republic. Hopefully you can see the role of Egyptian teachers there in disseminating this information. Another aspect beyond the nature of the Arab Cold War that I wanted to briefly touch on has to do with how migration as soft power touches upon ideas of nationalism and pan-Arabism at the time. And one of the interesting things I am focusing on has to do with Egyptian teachers' activism in North Africa at the time. And what they were doing is they were using Egyptian textbooks for Libyan students, for instance. This is from a 1962 report from the educational activities in Benghazi. And this is an Egyptian textbook that was used for students that says, I'm an Arab, I say it with all pride and happiness, I'm not alone, yes, I'm an Arab from Libya. And what is interesting here is that it mirrors very, very closely the exact same narrative and rhetoric that was taught to Egyptian school children in Egypt at the time. And this is a poem that Egyptians, primary school students in the mid-1960s had to memorize that has to do with essentially the same sort of rhetoric of I'm an Arab, I love the Arabs, and so on and so forth. What you need to keep in mind here is this sort of connections between educational politics within Egypt that take its own trajectory, of course, and how these are mirrored very, very closely upon other countries through the soft power of Egyptian teachers. This might be a bit too small, I apologize if you can't read it. This is again from archival work, and it details a sports gala in Kuwait, in Shuai, in May 1957. And the participant there, who's British, recounts how there were about 2,100 students participating from 26 Kuwaiti schools. And what caught his attention is that this was organized by the Egyptian Inspector of Education at the time, and it was very much mirrored around essentially Nasserite ideals and Nasserite priorities in terms of regional politics. So the show, or the sports gala, started off with the tune from Voice of the Arabs. The students then had to bring in a historical tableau that represented the Battle of Port Said. The Battle of Port Said is, of course, the 1956 Suez Canal key battle. There was a sign on the float with large letters that said, "Get out of my canal." What I found quite interesting is that they also had a song for each Arab state. So Egypt had a bit of a song about how it's the champion of Arab freedom, the repeller of the aggressors. Yemen is the protector of Aden. Syria is the home of true nationalism. Iraq at the time, which was not in very good terms with Egypt, was a subject of sarcasm. And at the end of the day, all of these small boys came in with air rifles, essentially. All of this organized by this Egyptian Inspector of Education. Yet again, a very interesting sort of example of how education functions as a way of promoting certain types of nationalism abroad. Wing goes on. This is a teacher at the time describing Libya and Libyan politics, and she describes how pupils had to do drawings of Egyptian troops winning victories over Israel. What I found interesting is that they had an art display, and students were actually, it was suggested to them that they draw the bad rulers on one side and the good rulers on the other side. The bad rulers were the pharaohs, and ended up with King Farouk, of course, the Egyptian ousted monarch, and the good rulers ended up with Gamal Abdel Nasser. And this is in 1950s Libya, and this is one of the classrooms where supposedly also Gaddafi was essentially educated in. So I argue that we have to understand the rise of nationalism in the region. We do have to understand the role of of migration here, and particularly the role of high-skilled educational migration. Of course, this never went quite as planned. Many times we had expulsions and deportations of Egyptians, so there is a lot in the literature about how Lebanon, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia did not take very kindly to this, so they tried their best to resist this Nasserite propaganda. One of the more interesting things I found is this tidbit about Libya under King Idris. So this is a few years before Gaddafi comes into power, where King Idris is informed that this propaganda is taking place in secondary school classrooms, and he has Libyan secret police dressed up as students in order to detect which Egyptian teachers engage in this propaganda and to expel them, of course. What is interesting is that at the end of the day, most of them came back in because they were needed by these developmental states. So Egyptian teachers, Egyptian engineers, Egyptian nurses and doctors were in fact in heavy demand. And this goes back to this original image of the Yemeni schoolgirls being taught by Egyptian teachers in a school essentially built by Egyptian engineers. So what's next for this? The next step in this research project, and it is very much ongoing, is this aspect of soft power antagonism. In other words, hopefully I've convinced you a bit about not taking labor migration as a purely economic or apolitical process, that there is something political about this. What I'm doing next is to try to look at whether soft power actually functions in any sort of antagonism between states. And what is interesting here is this story that I'm slowly trying to uncover about antagonism between Egypt and Israel in sub-Saharan Africa. This is I thought this was a very funny sort of illustration that the Egyptians disseminated in Arab Observer, this English language magazine of the 1960s, where the old picture is, of course, the colonial white male, followed by the African servants, and of course the new picture after liberation is completely inversed. What is interesting here is that both states, both Egypt and Israel in this key moment of the 1950s and 1960s saw a huge opportunity. The colonial states in Africa were decolonizing, they were becoming independent, and they were becoming a huge voice in the United Nations at the time. Each of these African states, I think some 60 states by the end of the century, were given a vote that counted as much as the Egyptian vote in the United Nations. So Israel sees this as an opportunity to affect these African states and to get them to support the Israeli cause, and Egypt sees this as an opportunity as well to counter this. It is no accident that Nasser will talk about these three circles. The Arab circle, the African circle, and the Islamic circle. And the African circle we kind of forget sometimes when we talk about the Nasserite regime, but he would say we cannot look stupidly at the map of the world and not realize our place therein and how our role is determined to us by the place that Egypt is in. And what he talked about has to do a lot with these geopolitical realities of African independence politics. So Muhammad Hassanein Haikal would identify the fact that Egypt now needs to send missions of experts, science, religion, politics, economics, commerce, social sciences, to aid the African people, to support them, to collaborate with them, and to light the path before them. Very sort of heavy in rhetoric and ideas, but when it comes down to the ground, this has to do very much with the antagonism between Israel and Egypt about winning the hearts and minds of the African states. So this is a longer quote from the Arab Observer. Again, I'm sorry for the size. This is still Haikal, who identifies the strategy. And he has it all figured out. This is 1964. He says that once a new independent African state comes in and celebrates its independence, an Israeli delegation comes in with a deep and detailed study of the problems of this country. And while all other delegations offer their congratulations, the Israelis are speaking about the problems that these countries are facing. So once most delegations return home after this celebration, the African ruler, he says, keeps the Israeli envoy because he can discuss post-independence problems. So an Israeli mission returns with economic, technical, and cultural agreements. So what we have here essentially is that Israel is seeing an opportunity of aiding this newly independent state with development in all sorts of fronts, and then Israel is going to reap the rewards. The argument goes in the United Nations, in bilateral relations, and so on and so forth. So what I'm trying to track over the next couple of years is essentially how this worked. What kind of Egyptian staff were sent to Africa, how they interacted with the Israeli technicians and economists and social scientists already there, and what kind of effects there are. This is a very sort of neat period between the early 1950s and 1967. This whole antagonism between Egypt and Israel in Africa essentially ends with the Six-Day War. And once Israel comes in as a victor, then we have the abandonment by 1973 onwards of African states' support for Israel. But again, this is a story that very much ends in 1970. 1970 having come at the aftermath, of course, of the Six-Day War and this moral, political, economic decline of Nasserism. And we have a large sort of movement towards arguably what we would call a depoliticization of migration in terms of Egyptian immigrants abroad. So what we see from 1970 until today is that we have this abandonment of migration as a form of soft power. Sadat, and later on Mubarak, and so on and so forth, comes in and says, well, we need to talk about economics. We don't need to talk about politics anymore. This is something that the journalist Anis Mansour wrote in Al-Asbab. By 1974, he said, well, there needs to be a shift in how we view migration. An Egyptian was looked upon as the man with the ugly face. Every Egyptian seemed to be a spy or a saboteur. Every Egyptian teacher was thought to have come to overthrow the standing rule, to distribute literature. Every doctor was a spy acting for the Egyptian intelligence service, blah, blah, blah. Now the Egyptian migrant is no longer interested in these people's affair. So give and take is the motto that runs Egyptian migration. So we have this shift from 1970s onwards into a different model of migration management. Is this really apolitical? I would say it's still quite heavily political. This is a cartoon, this is the thing of Florida, if I'm not mistaken. This, of course, President Sadat embracing King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. And I would argue that Egyptian migration after 1970 serves an altogether different purpose for the Egyptian regime. Not one of soft power, but one of cooperation. And Egypt uses migration in a way to come closer together with oil-producing states, particularly in the Arab Gulf. So what have I tried to do in this sort of short presentation? Well, I tried to convince you of a number of things, and hopefully I've succeeded in a few of them. So for those of you who care about Middle East politics or Middle East studies, does migration become a social-political issue for Egypt only after 1970? Should we keep looking at migration in Egypt after 1970 rather than before? Hopefully I've convinced you a bit that there is something to be said about what Egyptian migrants were doing in the run-up to 1970 under Gamal Abdel Nasser or before. What is the range of strategies employed in Nasser's pan-Arabism and the Arab Cold War? Of course, the voice of the Arabs, the rhetoric, the propaganda, the war in Yemen are all still at the forefront of this antagonism between Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Hopefully, you might think also of how migrants were used in this. And if you do believe that Egyptian teachers played a role in this antagonism, then hopefully I've convinced you that from a migration studies perspective, those of you that are migration scholars, labor migration and diaspora politics is not really economically driven all the time. It is not an apolitical supply-demand process. There is something distinctly political here. There's something that we need to keep looking, and arguably there's something that has to do with international relations, which is my view. So essentially going back to the beginning question that led this presentation, which is what is this foreign policy importance of diaspora groups? Do they have a foreign policy importance or not? I would say if we look at Egypt, if we look at what happened over this very important 2 decades, there is something to be said about them acting either as agents of nationalism or as promoters of Nasserite politics abroad, but in all sorts of ways as essentially elements of soft power for the Egyptian regime. Shameless plug, this is part of a book that's coming out next year with Manchester University Press, and examines this from 1952 up until the Arab Spring in 2011, essentially. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gerasimus Skrapos, for your, as usual, brilliant presentation and brilliant analysis and brilliant ideas. There's a lot to be commented upon. So I will take 5 minutes to make my comments before opening the floor. To me, your study, the extreme interest of your study is because it sheds light on how foreign policy of Egypt in the Arab world and subsidiary in Africa has used technical expertise to project its ideas and to project its concept of an Arabism, because I think that is very specific. I am, for one, I do not believe that Egypt, that Nasser was an Arabist. But, and I have, but this is another discussion. So there is certainly projection of ideas. Now, the interest of your presentation is really, if it can be theorized, in the sense that if it cannot be confined only to Egypt and only to the 1952-1970. And I will put a question to you. Did Morocco or Tunisia or Turkey have political objectives when Turkish, Moroccan, and Tunisian workers and Yugoslav workers went to France, Germany, and the Netherlands in the 1960s? Did they want to influence really French politics, or German politics, or Dutch politics? Was Bourguiba in a position, or was Mohammed V in a position to influence German or Dutch or French politics in this sense? This really is, and I think that we've had this discussion before. This is not the first time that we had this discussion. We had it at Cambridge last year. And I think you do a brilliant analysis of projection of Egyptian technical cooperation. Otherwise, how would you call the French coopérant? Is it migration? Are Italians that are working all over the Mediterranean in the 2015, are they migrants? So, in fact, it depends on how we define migrant. So, of course, if we define in 1930s, Sanoui was in I think we already mentioned this, was in Iraq writing the civil code in Iraq and bringing together Islamist Sharia and Western law. So this really is my question. So isn't this rather technical cooperation? Like technical cooperation projected by Germany, for instance, in here or there, or by Italy or there, or by USAID, here or there. So this is really now the African circle was not at all neglected under Nasser. And we're certainly aware of Shirkat al-Nasr, Iran, and by the way, now in Egypt, people realize that under Nasser, the African circle was really important in Egyptian foreign policy, which it has not been since 1970, except for what was Rally when he was interested in it. So really, these are my main. You said Abdullah Salam asked for technical help. You see, so of course, technically speaking, of course, if I go somewhere and I am there for 12 months plus 1 day, I'm a migrant. But to which extent are the French, for instance, school teachers in the Lycée Français here in Cairo, are they really migrants? Of course, they project French culture and they project French influence. So this really is, apart from that, it is a fantastic piece of research about how Nasser's Egypt, and by the way, before Nasser, it's not only Nasser, before Nasser, how Egypt, for the reason you mentioned, Egypt was an early development, an early state, when the state did not exist. So it's very, really very interesting, and as usual, I'm really expecting to read you when you publish your piece, and also do not discard the demand. There was demand from Morocco, and education was French. So in order really to regain independence, you have to regain your language. So the Egyptian professors of law, for instance, went to the faculty of law, University Mohammed V in Morocco. So there is demand. So demand from Abdullah Salam, demand from Morocco, and at times this demand and the supply has resulted, like in Algeria, for instance, in the growth of Islamist political forces. So there is, of course, there is a political consequence of migration. Not always a political determinant, but a political consequence. Like Egypt in the 1970s, it's economic, essentially, to release pressures on the labor markets even before remittances. So this is what I have, and thank you very much again for your brilliant presentation. I'm not surprised, and the floor is open.
My parents belong to that generation. But from what they told me, I can't
Oh, here.
My parents belong to their generation, and what they say, and a lot of their friends and relatives say, that one of the reasons they wanted to get out of Egypt is they were fed up with the political, stranglehold, and again, this whole civil service and security checks and all these things. So this idea Egyptians don't want to go over, that's not true, even from back then, even in the good old days. The other thing is, why is it that Abdel Nasser didn't invest in Egyptian communities abroad in the same way that the Israelis or the Armenians or the Lebanese or the Greeks do, and have proper lobbies and lobby politics and parliaments and influence in the media? Why did it have to be this kind of subterfuge type of way?
Should I answer this too? Okay. First of all, to Dr. Ibrahim's comments, that of course we've had this discussion in the past, so I don't think we're going to resolve it in the next half an hour, but I'm curious to hear what you all think. Do you think this is a form of migration, or do you think I'm stretching the argument a bit? So if you think it's a form of migration, do speak up, because I visit Thank you for my discussion with Dr. Ibrahim. Is this, I'll harbour one thing that you said, which is this an isolated phenomenon in world politics? Is this just something that happened because Nasser was in a particular position in the Arab world at the time? The Arab world needed to develop, so, well, 1 + 1 = 2. I added, that doesn't explain Israel, for instance. So Israeli politics vis-a-vis the African states, and Israel organized dispatch of technicians and engineers and scientists in the thousands in Africa is also similar to this.
But isn't this migration?
I would say,
This is the issue really. Are the Israeli experts migrants in Zimbabwe or
in the sense that they chose to do this and they moved to a different country and they stayed there for more than a year and they were paid for this by that country, why should it not be migration? And if it's not migration, what is it? Is it something that we haven't conceptualized in IR?
technical cooperation? It's technical cooperation.
I use the term diasporas in this. I use it as a sort of like the existence of...
Again, it will need definition, because diaspora not any community that is somewhere for 5 years is diaspora. You see, so what is really a diaspora? Egyptians migrate and return.
One thing that...
So the term diaspora also has to be, the concept has to be defined.
One thing that might help is whether this has happened elsewhere. And one of the places where this has happened elsewhere is Cuba, for instance. So the Cuban regime under Castro had a very restrictive policy of not allowing immigration for a number of reasons, apart from one exception that has to do with doctors and nurses. Doctors and nurses were able to be sent to Latin America, sub-Saharan Africa, yes, some to the Middle East, and also Libya was a place. And that, so they spent time there, they worked, they returned. I would conceptualize this as Latin American scholars do, which is a form of elite migration. We'll see if it applies, but I'm curious to see what you all think of this. The question on Gamal Abdel Nasser, you're quite right about this. So one of the most interesting things for me was all the restrictions that the regime had put in place to prevent migration at the time. So this is the exception, this elite educational migration. But you needed an exit visa, you needed, if you were a civil servant, you needed permission from way up above to migrate. You needed, you needed to get a return ticket from Misr Air or Egypt or whatever it was in order to secure permission to migrate. So it was next to impossible at the time. So I hear you quite well on that Egyptians did not migrate. That has to do with the discourse of the regime at the time. Why didn't Nasser invest in communities abroad? I would say this has to do with the regime's own foreign policy at the time. So if you think that you have a few thousand Egyptians in the US, you wouldn't try to capitalize on them because you're a non-aligned power. You're not supposed to align yourself either with the Soviets or with the Americans. You're supposed to be this beacon of third worldism at the time. So it wouldn't make sense for Nasser to come in and do it. Who actually did try to do this was Sadat. Sadat would try to build up this image of the Egyptians abroad, in my understanding. And he ran into all sorts of problems when it comes to the Coptic diaspora, for instance, and protests against the Sadat regime in the late 1970s. And since then, under Mubarak, under Boutros Ghali, there's been a lot of effort to build up the Egyptian diaspora as a source of development, essentially, with varying degrees of success that we can speak.
But Egyptians go to the United States after the change of migration law in the 1960s. So in fact, they did not have sufficient time under Nasser.
Yes, it's a very small community.
Very, very small community. They start migrating, in fact, as Nasser dies. So this is...
There's an interesting story going about how once he dies in the 1970s, you have all these queues around the American embassy for visas and so on and so forth that never existed in the past.
Because of the change in the law in the US.
Yes, because of that as well. So because of the changes in the law. So it's a very interesting few years of history. Sorry, yes.
Okay, thank you. There was a political figure had been instituted by Nasser and his regime, which is called Tanzim Talia. I don't know how I can translate that in English. So my question is, was there a relation between these migrants and this political figure, support this figure, or something like that?
Should I answer one at a time, or should I?
Let's take two more questions and then next.
I'm Sami Ammar, a PhD candidate at Cairo University. I studied migration and politics, and how much we have a correlation between migration and politics in the Middle East. And I just wonder, of course your presentation was so great, but I guess we have some points that should be highlighted more. We have a lot of stories of success for migrants, Egyptian migrants in different countries, in European countries and in African countries, in diaspora societies abroad. And I wish to have a space for these stories. And I remember what was going on during the Abdel Nasser era. Migration was heavily politicized, and the state was the upper control or the upper hand in everything in Egypt. It was a socialist country. We have a socialism in Egypt, and the country was so. The government was so tough to many citizens. But now, if we make a comparison between what's going on during Abdel Nasser and what's going on right now, we can have Turkish and Qatari gates, because now if you fly to Turkey, you have to get a permission to enter the country from Egypt. Yes, and thank you. Actually, the presentation was wonderful, and if you have any example of success stories for Egyptian migrants abroad, or even non-Egyptian migrants who came to Egypt and made success here in the Egyptian society, and learn about impact in our society here in Egypt, I would be so grateful for you. Thank you.
I just wanted to comment or to ask about Dr. Aoud's question. Why you don't see it as migration? Do you see it as technical cooperation because they are sent by the regime for a certain purpose? If this is so, then it's also migration because the person himself or herself. Why do I migrate? I migrate because I want to earn money. So I think it's migration, but it was used by the state for political.
Thank you, thank you, everyone. Yes, I would agree. It's at the end of the day, it's in the eating or whatever the English saying is about it. So it depends on whether I'm making a convincing case or not. In my sense, every sort of indication of migration in terms of going abroad for economic purposes, selecting to do that, and so on and so forth, staying there for more than 12 months, which is the IOM Holy Grail. UN, I'm sorry, no, not IOM. It's there. So it could be both in a way, but I do agree. Success stories, you're completely right. So my presentation ends in 1970, so the range of success stories arguably would come later on as more and more, as millions of Egyptians go abroad. So I'm not going to name them. People like Magdi Yacoub, for instance, in London, the cardiologist, and so on and so forth. All these famous Egyptians that are part of the Egyptian diaspora, you're quite right. So I did not mean to paint a one-sided picture of Egyptian migration at the least. In terms of the revolutionary vanguard, that's a really good question, and I would welcome your feedback on this one, whether you think there's something there. My understanding of the regime at the time is unfortunately quite homogeneous, in the sense that I haven't identified select links that exist there. The only sort of nuancing that exists has to do with Muslim Brothers going abroad, communists, royalists, ancien regime sort of people that leave Egypt at the time, but nobody associated with the vanguard itself. I had this sort of letter by the Revolutionary Council, but that's as far as my knowledge of this goes. So if you know anything more, please. But it's quite important to sort of try to break down the regime as a unitary actor. So I would take that as a valuable conversation.
Could I ask a question? Yes, please.
A question, please.
Yes. Very short. Well, I searched for the concept diaspora for several times in different resources, in different sources, and actually we have a lot of definitions for this concept. And actually, I need a specific definition for diaspora. What is diaspora? Thank you.
We could have a whole 2 more hours on the concept of diaspora, but I'm going to spare you that. No, you're quite right. It's what we would call in political science an essentially contested concept, essentially. Much like concepts like democracy, all these sort of issues, everybody has a separate definition. What I'm using in my work is an expansive sort of definition by Brubaker. So Rogers Brubaker, who looks at the diaspora as citizens, descendants of citizens, and co-ethnics. So essentially anybody who has either a formal linkage to the state via citizenship, via nationality papers and so on and so forth, or an informal relation vis-a-vis a sense of kinship or a sense of friendliness towards a specific country. But you're completely right that it's a concept that we're struggling with. I don't know if you have anything to add to that in terms of the definition of diaspora, essentially.
I think, as Dr. Gerasimov said, it's a very contested concept, and I think what is interesting in our subjects is that you do not have a final word. You always have room for discussion. You have flexible concepts. You have a concept, and Dr. Gerasimov have a concept. There is no one concept. So there are different definitions. There is a term, and there are different conceptualization of the term. And discuss, otherwise we would not be discussing here. This is what makes interesting the social sciences. Social sciences are an area where there are different perspectives and different understanding. So for instance, this is a very large definition of diaspora. Look at Lebanon. Lebanon now, there is a movement to give the right to vote and to give the citizenship to practically anyone who claims citizenship, even if is a descendant of a migrant in the late 19th century. So at least some are interpreting it this way. So yes. So the president of Brazil, by the way, would be a diaspora, a Lebanese diaspora, the Brazilian president. You see? So it's the Egyptian diaspora. Egyptians migrate and return. Egyptians migrate and return. This would be a different diaspora than, let's say, the same Egyptian in the United States or Canada. And they would have a different behavior.
Or Palestinians or Syrians.
For instance, no, I'm talking about the very same Egyptians.
Can have someone to go back.
But the very same Egyptians are going to the Gulf or going to the United States and New Zealand and Australia. They would be different in their behavior. Of course, Syrians and Palestinians are very particular also because they can't even claim to be diaspora because there is no homeland that is waiting for them. So it is a very interesting concept, and we have to take it as it is. So, for instance, there is this concept by our friend, the virtual homeland, the virtual homeland, where diaspora is part of the political system and of the homeland. So yeah,
What I would just add to this, you're completely right. What I tell my students when they're trying to study diaspora migration politics is I encourage them to look at the political construction of this. So every definition of a diaspora has some political undertone behind it. So the Lebanese asking for an expanded version of a diaspora has a lot to do with the political realities of the Lebanese state. The Palestinians do it for different reasons, for valid reasons, but for political reasons. So every definition of a diaspora, our job as PhD students, as researchers, is to uncover the politics behind it.
This expansive definition in Lebanon is to give more power to one of the Lebanese political colors or political tendencies. So of course nothing is for nothing, but it's an interesting concept. So any more questions? So whether it is migration as supported by myself, or whether it is technical, in any case, it is the use of human resources for projecting political, whether it is migration policy or cooperation for development policy. In either case, it is the use of a human resource, a highly skilled human resource, for the purpose of projecting ideas. And this is of great importance, whatever or whichever way you conceptualize. So thank you very much to all of you, to the audience, for being here and for your interactions with Dr. Gerasimus. And of course, I thank him, and it's always a pleasure for me. It is delightful to listen to you and to discuss. Thank you very much for your